Well, yeah, who knew? A bunch of camera geeks. We get together. We're recording a podcast, and how long did we just spend playing and goofing? Like a good solid 15
minutes or so, actually trying to sort out the visual stuff.
Just monkeying with all the different cameras and then getting all the framing right. So you can't, you can take a camera out of our hands.
Who thought an audio podcast would be so complicated with cameras?
Oh my gosh! I think am having a little bit of trauma from the holiday special, editing all the video footage for that one because it was a little complex.
So listeners probably wouldn't realize that the difficulty of doing a multi-person podcast with multiple camera feeds,
and then microphones dropped, and it was it was overkill to say the least.
It was, yes, but it does mean people do need to go back and watch that episode or listen to it. Only to stroke your ego because you did a fantastic thing with video.
If for nothing else, or for no other reason, please just go watch it so that it validates
so Sean
the amount of,
feels better.
Yeah, it also validates the amount of time I spent on it too.
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to even count the hours that I spent doing that. But it was a labor of love. So it was again a great episode. But yeah, I mean that's the thing. We had another episode too where we're like behind all these cameras. And right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 5 cameras in the room at minimum. At least 3 of which are recording. But we should also say,
partly because we're talking about cameras and visual representation this week.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is an episode. I mean, if you haven't already sniffed it out, both Andrew and I are huge photography geeks. Even for me, even professionally, but even before coming to ASU.
Right, yes,
I mean, this was.
See, you're the pro in the room. I'm just the sad amateur.
But yeah, I mean, so for me, it has been a passion, a labor of love, a profession. I've taught photography and digital. I mean, this is something that I think I've referred to it. I think my wife has heard this many times when I'm like, I need that new camera. You don't understand. It's a part of my soul that is like, there's a hole there that can only be filled by.
So
by
you realize my wife is going to be listening to this and thinking, yeah, I get it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think one of the things will be so fun to talk about today because I think, and I will say, I think the photography element we're just going to scratch the surface here because this one is incredibly fascinating around the area of photography and imaging. And this spreads now. Like when we talk photography, we're not just talking about a traditional camera in hand. We're talking about the mobile devices.
Right.
We talked an episode that dropped last week with Bruno. We talked about cameras in cars, and I mean they're everywhere.
They are.
Your Ring doorbell. Cameras and optical imaging sensors are everywhere.
And it's the fact that between that lens and that sensor, you've got AI that's altering things. So who knows whether what we're seeing is what was originally there.
Is even there. And I think originally it was like, let's take a break from AI this week. And we'll talk about...
No, we're going to come back to AI. No, let's try and...
We'll take a break. We'll talk about something pure and innocent. We'll talk about photography. And then it's like, and that's right. We can't get too far without talking about computational photography and things like that. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. We both brought camera. We have cameras in the studio with us because this
is really, really sad for those of you watching the videos. I mean, there we are with our,
that's right.
Respective
They become
beasts.
Part of your identity.
Yes.
At one point, I think I had a profile picture, which of course was like the half camera. You couldn't help it. It's all part. So we can explore a lot of that kind of things. But I think also one of the things that I think will be really fun today is kind of, again, exploring this idea of like these computational tools that are inserting themselves or have already been inserted in what used to be otherwise purely human tasks. And again, I think this episode too, as we explore through photography, is also an allegory for almost so many other things. I mean, writing. Most human pursuits of art and writing and creativity, I think.
And what you as the human put into it and what others actually pull out of it.
Yeah. Yep. And thinking about, so I guess if I were to put it in like a framing teaser question before we roll our intro, is really exploring that tension that exists between how do we continue the advancement of these technologies, insert them in these places, but without losing the humanity
what
of
it means to be human.
What it means to be human, right? And so when does it stop becoming a photograph and become an image?
Yes.
So with that, why don't we roll our intro and we'll jump right into this thing.
Initializing waveform.
Modulating signals for transmission.
Fixed
exploring the possible, probable, and preferable futures.
Welcome to Modem Futura. All right. So we're talking cameras today. If you don't know us by now, it's possible too, if this is your first episode joining us, I'm Sean Leahy and I'm joined by
Andrew Maynard.
And that means this is Modem Futura, the show that explores the intersection of technology, society, and the possible, probable, and preferable futures, asking deep questions like, what will it mean to be human in the future? And I think as we talk about photography and digital imaging, I think that question is it's already been a hot topic for quite a few years, but I think it's becoming even more so. Or perhaps there's been a distraction of it of late with ChatGPT and generative AI on the output side of things, which we can certainly talk about as well. But I think what's exciting and concerning all the same is to talk about and think about, what does this mean now? Again, as we just talked before we rolled the intro, what does this mean for the process, the creative process of when we're inserting things like AI or computational elements between essentially the artist and its subject?
Right. Yes.
Right. So lots to unpack, lots to uncover, and for people, and I think one thing we should just say right off the bat is that while of course we couldn't resist the temptation to bring in more traditional camera systems, photography is something, and this is I think part of the smartphone sort of revolution or evolution, however you want to sort of phrase it, is that it really helped bring photography to the masses in a way that traditional camera systems had made progress with digital cameras and such, but never to the scale. And I forget what it is. I don't have any figures off the top of my head, but the amount of photographs taken, I think at one point, this is probably almost a decade old now, so I don't know what the current one is. Maybe I'll search it in a minute. But that the number of photographs taken in 1 year had surpassed all of human photography, archives of our existence.
Quite unbelievable. And you just get a sense of that if you just look at your photo archive on your phone. I mean, most people, they've got a gazillion photos there. But of course, if you put it in a historical context and you go back to the Kodak box Brownie, which I have one. Really?
Yes.
See, that's impressive. Yes. That shows that you're either the pro or the geek or the obsessive here. I'm not quite sure which.
Or, yes, all three perhaps. Ring the bell.
But that sort of began to bring mainstream photography to the masses. Now it was accessible to a lot of people. And you saw that progression through the years with cheaper and cheaper cameras. I remember when I was a teenager, I used to sell cameras. And I remember the little 110 film ones the disc films. The quality was lousy. But people use them to capture those memories.
Those moments.
Yes.
The moments.
Which was important. But the difference I think we saw with digital over the last sort of few years or so is those were poor quality representations of memories. There was very little manipulation. It was what the camera saw, and they weren't great. There was not much artistic sort of expression there unless you knew what you were doing. But they were caught memories. And all of a sudden, with phones and with digital cameras, it was not just capturing the memories, it was capturing them in high definition. It was capturing them in ways that you can manipulate and enhance and do all sorts of things with.
Yeah, it really expanded. And I think, is it worth touching? I do have a brief rundown of history of photography. Is it worth doing? Okay.
You should do.
I took the effort to put this down in this note, so I feel compelled.
This is going to be one of those episodes where I'm reining you in because you are just going to want to talk about this till the cows come home.
I'm sort of having that insecurity of being like, Sean, cool it, man. You're going to lose it. You're going to lose it. But okay, so and especially I think for people who might be interested or they joined photography with smartphones, right? Is also understanding sort of the long history of sort of photography and camera equipment. But essentially going all the way back, the birth of photography, right, is sort of early 1800s, 1826. Essentially, Joseph Nicephore Niepce is sort of credited as taking the first captured photograph, right? Then comes along, the daguerreotype images and things like that. And then in 1888, George Eastman introduces sort of the box camera, and then sort of move into what is considered a sort of like the golden age, if you will. So basically the 1900s.
Right.
Early the Kodak Brownie, 1900, 1924, the Leica joins the mix.
Yeah.
And then 1948, key milestone, Polaroid. So remember those?
I remember those from my youth.
Yeah.
I had a black and white Polaroid
Absolutely,
camera.
which was one of the first, I think it was the first sort of instant camera in the sense where you could take a photograph and it would spit out the print that you would wave. I remember waving it in the air to like try to increase the development time and things like that. And then of course 1960s, 70s, 80s. This is like the heyday of the SLRs.
Yes,
right?
of course.
The single lens reflex. So this is the camera most people think about when you think about like
that
a camera.
iconic view of a camera.
The
yes, with the viewfinder and the pentaprism on top.
With a little pentaprism on top. You look through. So the eyepiece you would put up to your face would through essentially a mirrors.
I love the way you're describing this. You can imagine all those sort of 50 to 20-year-olds out there thinking, eyepiece? What are you talking about? Where's the screen?
That's right. But long before you looked at a screen, you would hold it to your eye. And the only way you could to help compose the image, right, is you're looking through the lens, which is
actually really important here.
Yes.
That idea of seeing what the camera is going to capture.
That's right. And that's one of the key pieces is so for the longest time, when we think about photography, most of the equipment has enabled in various ways. There's also things called like a dual reflex camera, which is interesting. It has two lenses, or twin lens reflex. It has two lenses, things like that.
Yeah.
There's been different ways. There's been through the lens compositions, and then there's other types of cameras where you would look through a viewfinder that did not go through the lens.
Right. Yes, which is the same as the one I've got here. So this is the viewfinder, rangefinder.
Rangefinders, and the twin reflex, for example. You look through a spotting lens that's just above the lens that lets in the light, takes the image, things like that. But so during this time, this is sort of like the absolute heyday, and this is where you see. It's funny now to be like, if you aren't old enough, you may not have this memory of like film canisters and reloading film and wasting film and what it was like to take film to go get it developed.
Yes.
Even if you didn't, most people, I would say, unless you were a serious enthusiast or professional, you didn't have darkroom technologies in your home. But you would take them to, and at the height of this stuff, I mean, every shopping mall, every large grocery store chain.
You took them in, you got your ticket, and whether it was a few hours or a day or so later, you got your package back and you flip through them.
And you have this experience of discovering, thumb, all black, all
ceiling,
white. So there were a lot of wasted frames. Yeah. But yeah, it was this, there was a delay in that as well. But then, skipping forward, sort of, then we have this kind of weird era of sort of like, I would say the development period is like late 80s, early 90s of sort of like those first digital cameras. And, surprisingly, if you're a camera aficionado, you also know that, at one point Kodak reigned supreme.
Yes.
In fact, actually, one of their engineers was credited for building the very first digital camera prototype.
Right.
Yet, famously, they missed the boat on digital.
But remember those days. So I remember it must have been mid to late 90s when I got one of the first Apple cameras. This was yes. It was 480 pixel camera, and it was actually surprising.
480 pixel, not megapixel.
No, pixel. And it took about 8 photos or something. But I remember at that time people poo-pooing this. They said this will never ever be a thing. Film will reign supreme. And then the whole edifice collapsed.
Yeah, it did, and spectacularly and very quick, because all of a sudden you have this. So again, so that we have this weird time where digital is just kind of making sense, and it's terrible. Like the quality is terrible, and it couldn't, at the time of its inception, it couldn't hold a candle, if you will, to what was possible in like the commercial space.
Yes,
certainly, in terms of the quality of what you could do with film photography. Because also, if you think about the business of that, right, it's not just home, filling up your home photo album. It's all of like advertising, commercial.
Of course,
so these are enlarged, right? So all the
Mm-hmm.
posters and billboards that are done with photography, that was all done through film and enlargements, and shooting in medium format, large format, different types of film that could get you these sort of massive. So at the time when you get a 400 pixel image, very low resolution, crappy colors, and you look at that compared to like the portfolio of someone shooting a high-end Hasselblad, like medium format, just not even there. Yeah. So initial critics, they were also kind of right. Digital wasn't there and it wasn't ready. And there was sort of this long overlap that kind of took place during sort of the early to mid 2000s.
That's right. Yes. Yep.
Right. Which is where, and that's also where you see this rise. And I remember just even going back to those, I remember, no surprise, I was a kid in high school and stuff that was always working in like the media labs and all that kind of stuff. And I still remember the first digital camera our school got was a Sony, and I'm blanking on the name, but it took a 3.5 inch floppy disk
seriously?
For the memory card. It was the coolest thing.
Right.
You would like flip open. It just had a great mechanical feel. You'd flip over this door and like you'd slide in the disk and it would have this satisfying clunk as it went in, and you're like, wow. And so I remember going to a football game and being like, I'm going to take pictures of the football game, for like the school yearbook or something. And just being like, this is amazing. But then because you could take the picture and see it.
Yes.
And that was one of the first times that I personally had this experience.
Right. With seeing almost immediately what
the result was. So if you're like, and this thing held, I don't know, 20 pictures or something. I can't remember. Something small. But then you'd see and you're like, that had my thumb on it or whatever. And you could delete the image and try again.
Yes.
And so that was that first time where so for people like myself who had that early experience, you could see the value instantly. It wasn't even in whether the quality was there. It was that impermanence of, that loop of.
But I'm assuming still at this time, so this is sort of moving from film to digital, but you still felt that what you got was what you saw. So it came through the lens. You were looking either through the lens or adjacent to it. And the digital part of it just replaced film. But in essence, you were still getting what you expected.
That's right. And at that moment, the photographer, the user, was 100% responsible for everything that was captured.
Yes.
Right. And so initially, that initial switch to digital was essentially replacing what film does. So, to grossly just simplify it to speed it up. Otherwise, we'll be here for hours and I won't even get to the new stuff. Film, basically, you expose it to light and it exposes an image. The things that are dark are less exposed than the things that are light. And you get this wonderful
Although
on cellulose.
a placeholder for later in this conversation. So we tend to think about film as just capturing what we see, but of course it doesn't, because it depends on the film, the emulsion, how it's developed, how it's processed. But still, there was that sense that those photos that you saw, especially if you're an amateur photographer, that was a representation of what you saw.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we'll pin, because I can't even get through this timeline without being so excited. Because I'm like, then there's also, of course, the philosophical aspect of what it is to take a photograph, right?
Yes.
But just kind of coming back to the technology perspective is, so those early days, what was the major breakthrough was instead of using cellulose film to be the medium that the light would expose and capture, is replacing that with essentially a sensor that was light photosensitive.
Yes.
Right. And so you can almost think of it as the reverse of a screen, because it has basically pixels.
I love that analogy, actually.
Right? It's basically the reverse. So if you haven't ever, you look really quick, get a magnifying glass and look at your iPhone or whatever, or your computer screen, anything that's a digital screen, you will see the individual pixels within there. They can capture, and a screen displays light, but essentially the camera's sensor was comprised of those similar pixels or photoreceptors, but their job was to just capture the light.
Right.
And so for the first time, instead of using that film, it's an organic material that would be used once, and then you could expose it twice.
I was going to say throw it away, but no.
And there, but essentially it was a one-time use thing. Yep. And now with digital, you would capture that image, and then the processor in the camera would take that representation of pixels and where they hit, what was there, and each one is calibrating what level of light hit me, the individual pixel, what color perhaps. Some black and white only did tones, but if they're color, and then it would take that information, pass it to a processor, through this chain, and that processor eventually would write it to some sort of storage, right?
Yep.
So that was this huge breakthrough, which is now instead of wasting the film or going through, the standard for a 35 millimeter camera is usually at roughly 30, 35 pictures, and then you'd have to reload. But now, and then again, you'd have to develop and wait an hour, a week, whatever it took to get your prints back. Now with the digital camera revolution, suddenly, even if the picture quality could be suspect at the time, now you can see it and you can go, that composition was garbage. Let me try again.
Right. Yep.
And that was huge. So during this time, so then we usher into this time of the digital photography maturing. So this is the 2000s, right? So all the way up to 2010s essentially. And this is the major heyday for DSLRs, so digital SLRs. So basically replacing the same. So a lot of the camera function was identical, then just replaced with digital sensors. But the cameras still looked and operated very much the same. Even though as this is progressing, the technology, because they're like, hey, these are little computers. Even within that, the technology that you were able to start doing on the camera started to increase rapidly. Right.
Yes.
So you're starting to do things. Even though you had to manually tell your camera to do the thing, like taking multiple exposures, doing bracketing.
So this, to be clear, this is not artificial intelligence. It's just computers in your camera.
That's right. And it's saying, so for example, if you wanted to, in a film day, if you wanted to take multiple exposures of one thing, right? You would just manually have to keep track. I'm going to shoot at this exposure, take an image, change it, do that, and just keep that sequence. Digital cameras at that time, you could say, I want to take 5 pictures and I want to do them at one.
That's right. Slightly different exposure with each one.
And it says, okay, it's queued up for you. You just do it. And it kind of goes along the way. But then we get, of course, so 2007, iPhone drops, right? With what, it was a 1.3 megapixel camera,
I
something
remember.
like that.
I had one of those iPhones. I can't remember.
You're like, this is neat. But again, same thing. You're like,
remember at the time people were thinking, why put a phone in a camera?
That's right. And you're like, who's going to take pictures? That's like, there is always the philosophy, right? That the best camera is the one you have with you.
That's right. Yes.
So, we can all daydream about that one camera that's just outside of our realistic purchasing range. But realistically, whether it's a crappy disposable camera or a high-end camera,
it's the one you've got.
The one you've got is the one that matters. What can you do with that photograph or that equipment? So we start seeing this like late 2000s. Suddenly, mobile devices have cameras in them. Essentially, let's speed this up. So, smartphone photography era, right? 2010 to present. Essentially, I think I was making the joke earlier I've got one sitting up there, that one of the prime drivers of smartphone sales now is what is the camera?
Right. Yes.
Because, I don't think I've ever personally bought a new iPhone or any, smartphone because of its telephony capability.
This has got a really clear sound to it. Forget about the camera. That voice.
Those calls I don't take, those calls I send straight to voicemail.
Right.
Sound great.
No, it's the camera.
Yeah, it's the camera. Absolutely. And so now, and of course, especially with the rise of, smartphone cameras, it puts cameras in the pockets of, we know that's not true, but we'll say for everyone. But essentially doing that. So if you are carrying around this device, you're connected to it, you have an internet connection. The other thing that this did, I think that's incredibly powerful in terms of just the way people, again, bringing this concept of photography to everyone.
Right. Yes.
It also shortened the stack of, traditionally, if you went out and shot, even with a high-end digital camera, there was the whole process. So what do you do with it? You bring it back. It still mimicked very much an old film workflow, which is you'd bring back your trophies of the day on your camera. You'd load up your memory card in your computer. You would use some kind of software to edit that kind of stuff. Then what? You could print it. Maybe some things you put online, whatever. Now, when it's on your phone, right, you can go from like, I see something, I compose it, I grab the picture, and boom, it's on social media.
That's right. Yes.
Instantly.
Within seconds.
In moments, right? But then, of course, as these, it's sort of like this dual driver of, as those smartphones become the selling point of these, or the cameras become the selling point of these phones, a huge arms race between the I mean, the amount of advancement that took place in the camera and sensor system during this, it's still ongoing. It's just been incredible. And along with that comes like, hey, no one wants crappy photos.
Right. So how do you improve them?
How do you improve that? we have all this compute power sitting in these devices. What if we start using that to enhance the...
And that, I think, was a pivot point that not too many people understand. Because, of course, if you pull out your phone and look at those lenses, they're okay lenses.
Yep.
They do not compare to something like a $3,000 professional lens. You cannot put a $3,000 lens in that little sliver of glass.
Right.
Yes.
And especially as it's like, it must be thinner, lighter, and more mobile. And exactly, not possible. So even the lenses, even if you have... And glass adds weight, right? So a lot of times you're shooting actually through plastic. But yeah, and so, and it's fascinating when these sort of things start to happen, because also one of the challenges with photography, we were kind of joking that it's like, oh, you get your old prints back and half of them were garbage.
Right.
Photography, when you are controlling all of the aspects of exposure, is difficult.
Yes.
Like I used to teach for years. I used to teach an entry-level photography course in university. And it would take students, and still does, if you go that route, it takes a while to master the technology in your hand to get what you're expecting to see. I would love to go in deeper. We have, but there's a concept, but it's relevant to this idea of computational photography. So broadly speaking, to get something that you think is pleasing, besides assuming you have a good subject matter.
Right.
And that's objective, right?
Yes,
it's completely subjective to like, my child is a great subject matter to me. You may not care. Right. I don't know. Well, I hope, Andrew, you care, but
of course,
some
Sean.
Other person, like,
I will spend hours flipping through your phone photos of your kids.
But assuming you have that, right, you have essentially this exposure triangle. So you're dealing with shutter speed, which controls how fast basically the image is taken. You have the aperture, which controls things like depth of field and
how much light,
how much light you let in, which has a very that's probably one of the features that you could argue has the most artistic value. And of course, then there's the ISO, which is the sensitivity, which used to be film, but sensors have a similar rating, and they kind of brought that over. They could have started new, but to bridge that over, it still has a light sensitivity that we still use as the ISO rating. Used to be when you bought your film, it was labeled and you couldn't change it. Digital cameras, of course, you can change it, which is nice. But so suddenly you have this thing that's very difficult. And so there, you can see quickly a need to be like, well, what if we have technology that can help you kind of gloss over the need to know those things?
Take all that out of your hands, so you just focus on the picture you want to take.
That you focus on the moment. You focus on what it is you see. We'll handle the rest.
Yes.
And now, of course, that's a very divisive. That alone is very divisive, depending on who you talk to.
Right. Yes.
Because on the one hand, you have this argument of, let's make it easier for the user to get the output they want. However, that's where the tension, I think, really comes in, then you're like, okay, but you're offloading that knowledge, that experience, that.
So this feels
craft.
Very generative AI,
doesn't it?
Yes, you're taking a skill set
like
where
writing.
A good photo is associated with what you're able to do as somebody that's learned this skill. And all of a sudden, you're stripping all those skills away and giving them to a computer. So now anybody could do what you previously did.
That's right. And I think, initially too, I think it's something similar to the in shorter time span, but similar convergence. Oh, that's never be as good as like a DSLR. And I as professional, because I spent, my lifetime learning how to master exposure and how to know what I'm doing without having to think about it, without having to think about the mechanics. And now some device in your pocket can do all that for you. Like that's not fair.
And the pictures are fantastic. So we can get into sort of what is art and what is expression here. But if you're just looking at capturing what's happening around you, what you can do with a phone these days just blows me away. I would still argue that my very expensive camera here can do better.
Sure.
But it takes a lot of effort. To most people, they can do something great. And to the extent that, I take a lot of photos. I very rarely share them. I've got my own photo site that absolutely nobody knows about and nobody visits.
It's true.
And the reason is, I look at the internet and the amount of mind-blowing photos there are there. I look at mine and I think, these are mediocre.
Yeah.
Because everybody can do this now.
Yeah. Well, I've looked at your stuff. I can tell you they're not mediocre.
Well, that's very kind of you.
You got some bangers in there.
Same with you as well. But the fact is that there are some great photos out there taken by everyday people who just had a phone and just lifted it up.
Yeah. I mean, one of the best marketing campaigns has been Apple's Shot on iPhone campaign, where you see these, I mean, gorgeous, stunning photographs. And I mean, that's the marketing, is that was taken on a mobile device. That was taken on an iPhone.
Yep.
And I mean, I don't know if this would be fair for everybody, but at least from my perspective, I think gone are the days where you would say, well, an iPhone camera, or, whatever, a Pixel camera or something with a really good camera, or Pixel phone rather. I think gone are the days where you would say that's not a real camera.
Right.
To me, that's gone. I mean, I think that's just nonsense.
I agree.
Today.
Yes.
But,
but the reality is that those photos coming out of phones, they are digitally manipulated so that the phone makes the decisions around that sort of triangle of exposure factors. But then they're also digitally enhanced. So we get back to this idea of you have a lousy lens on there, and now AI, so it was compute and then AI does a lot of fancy stuff to take a messy photo and making it look really, really sharp. So it's all in the compute, not the lens.
It is. And, and to be fair, like, you want to hear more about this because we're glossing over a lot of stuff right now, but we have to, because there's so much to try to unpack here. But that's exactly it. So computational photography, for example, I mean, that literally is a computer, originally with just machine learning, taking things like, oh, this is underexposed.
Right.
I have a benchmark of I'll use air quotes here, of what a good exposure should be, because again, that's a very subjective call as well. But we know generally in photography, there is a range of exposure that would be considered properly exposed, so that you see the subject, you see the background, you see the foreground. Things aren't all in shadow or blown out with highlights, so things are just destroyed by sunlight or whatever. And so the camera would make those adjustments for you. And so going this kind of requires me to go back a step. When you go back to the digital SLRs, oftentimes those have a way of capturing images, which we call a RAW, which is basically a digital negative, meaning it gives you the full readout of the sensor that you can then, in post-processing, so like in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever, you can then revisit it and adjust those levels.
That's right.
And you get full, basically, control. So you get full digital darkroom.
Right. And a full creative control.
That's
over
right.
what comes out.
Now, those cameras are also capable of recording just JPEG images, which is what, we'll skip the HEI fancy new versions, but mobile phones, for example, only record a JPEG or equivalent. And that's a compressed image. That's a finished, sort of baked image.
Got all the processing there, yes.
Which you can still tweak, but the processing that came from the sensor to that image has been baked, and you don't get to touch it. And that's where, for me, that's where a lot of these issues really start to creep in. And
so to give an example of that, you can sort of see an okay sunset and take a picture. And when you look at it, it is unbelievably fantastic. Amazing.
You're like, wow, I'm so good at this.
Because the phone has decided that's what you wanted.
Yeah. And as things have progressed, right? I mean, that's one. So kind of quickly, just to kind of give a background here. So why and kind of where computational photography really got its hold is because it allowed for things on smartphones. And these features have also migrated into major camera lines as well. Because the camera industry, of course, there's not very many point and shoots that have survived this era. Before the smartphone came along, you could buy, there was hundreds to choose from, different kinds of small pocket-sized digital cameras. Well, of course, why would you carry two? So those have kind of gone away for the most part, coming back a little bit. But one of the things that's interesting is when you kind of go back, the addition of HDR, which stands for high dynamic range. So difficult lighting situations. Classic example of that is anything indoors, or anything outside where you have this mixture of shadow. So think of like a day at the beach. Where you have shooting normal photography at a beach is very difficult because you've got very bright, harsh sunlight. You've got very intense shadows. cameras traditionally have a very difficult time doing that. You either expose for the light, you expose for the dark, or you do both and combine them. But now these cameras are able to do this through the computationally, are basically doing this in fractions of a second. As you're making your composition and hitting that shutter button, it's taking multiple exposures, exposing for the light, exposing for the dark, and putting them together. And the beautiful...
And just pulling out everything that you want to see.
That's right. And then what you get is that beautiful sunset that if you were to take that photograph manually, I can tell you from 20 years of teaching this, that is very difficult to dial that in. Also, you get things like, especially more modern cameras, automatic like bokeh and portrait modes that can mimic the look of different apertures.
That's it, yes.
Because again, we're talking teeny tiny little plastic lenses mimicking what aesthetically you can do with very large aperture.
That's exactly it. So if anybody has used portrait mode on an iPhone, and I'm sure other phones have got a similar feature, you can effectively take the photo and then afterwards decide what the aperture is. So you have a slider that decides how much out of focus the background is, which is unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's incredible. I mean, even the early days, it would struggle around things like hair and things like that because it's trying to do an incredible. I mean, it's basically trying to do an entire Photoshop workflow.
Yes, it's almost like a digital twin of a real camera inside your phone.
Exactly. Which is cool, but that ability in post to change, like, this would look better if it was slightly more out of focus in the background, or.
And you can choose your subject. So if you don't like one subject, you can choose another one.
Take another one. Yeah. And that's all done. That's all thanks to this computational photography, because it has that capability. And then, of course, more recently, too, we're getting things like night mode. So that's been another really difficult thing traditionally with, I would say, again, I'll use air quotes here on traditional photography, is low light.
Yes.
If you shoot in low light, so if you've ever done this with a digital camera or a film camera, you know what that takes is long exposures, which doesn't capture motion. I mean, you can be very artistic with it.
Right.
But it...
or a very high-speed film, in which case you get a really grainy...
Yes. And if you crank your ISO up, I mean, everyone knows if you shoot a lot, you kind of know what your red line is for ISO, where you're like, oh, man.
Just can't work with that.
That's the difference of getting something or not, okay, but then you understand the quality is very... like.
And to put that into context, so I would never go above 400 ISO on film. 800 is really grainy. These digital cameras these days will go up to 64,000 ISO. Remember, normal is about 125, so 64,000, and the photos look sharp.
Just to put it in perspective, this one alone, it goes 512,000.
Which is crazy.
Which is like shooting in the dark.
You can walk
like
in a dark room and take pictures.
Yes.
Which also begs the question, I mean, sort of where do you draw the line between what you can see as a human and what your camera sees? Because now the camera is seeing what you do not see.
That's right. And that's so I think this brings us now to sort of like the real crux of the issue that is today. But my concern is again, as we think about this, what does this mean as we move forward?
Right.
Because I think it's wonderful and empowering. And I talk a lot about this in different things with all these types of medias that traditionally were a very vertical channel of you had to know someone, you had to have special access to equipment, you had to, find someone who could teach you how to do these things. Now, again, these have ushered in that anyone who has an interest in this sort of visual medium, from either whether it's just quick snapshots or they really want to get seriously involved in photography, can do so with such ease. And that is wonderful. I think it's, wasn't it Sir Isaac Newton who's credited with, if I've achieved anything, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants.
Yes,
and that's what we're all enjoying from what these new camera systems are capable of. But I will say that I think we're also ushering in an interesting point here, because as we continue to give more and more control to the image taking possibilities, and again, think of the allegory here for everything, the question is, what is lost?
Right? Yes.
So initially, can that tool be great for just going, a thing is happening in front of me, I want to capture it, and I got it. Great. Because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to do it. But once you reach some level of, competency or desire for expression, the question really becomes is, am I getting what I'm seeing?
Right. Yes.
Or why is this happening? Or what,
But surely on one level, this has been at the nub of photography since its inception.
Yeah.
Is this just a means to capture reality, or is it a means of artistic expression?
Yeah.
And I think that debate has gone on ever since that point.
This is a centuries plural old debate of what's the difference. And there's, even a question I used to love throwing out is what's the difference between an image and a photograph?
Right. What is it?
Well, it's the beauties. Well, the way I think that you can reduce it to a very simplistic argument is a photograph contains the decisions made by the photographer.
Right. Yes.
Right. Where an image is just in its simplistic form, an image is just a recording of something that was present.
So this seems really important. And I love that because, again, when I take photos and when I go through the whole workflow of processing them, that end photograph captures everything that I've put into it, everything that I want to achieve.
Yeah.
Which is, that's why I do it. But now you're getting to the point where in that workflow, it's not the human, it's a machine.
It's something else.
And increasingly, it's artificial intelligence. So now the photograph is an instantiation of what an AI decided was going to be good.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. I mean, when you think about I might start a controversy here by saying this, but I'm like, the beauty and the art of photography is what you're purchasing. Like, let's say you're buying a book, you're like, or a print, or you're like, I want to hang that on my wall, is asking the question, why? Like what?
Yes.
The art, the hope is right that the art is doing something to the viewer. It's invoking something, an emotion, a feeling, a thought, or, whatever. But what you're really paying for, right, is not the frame is worth, $100. The print paper is worth a couple cents, whatever. What you're paying for is to see from that artist's perspective.
Yes.
You're capturing what this is the thing too. I think this is another wonderful little thing I used to do all the time is first day of class, hand people a piece of paper. Say, draw me a picture of whatever it is you want. But the point of it was to try to get people to understand that they control, the photographer controls what's in the frame, what's out of the frame. Choosing what's in and what's out is
absolutely critical.
Right.
Yes.
What's out is just as important as what's in.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And so really when you're enjoying photography, when you're enjoying these images, what you're really, yes, the object can have its own subjective interest or beauty or whatever. But ultimately, the experience is you're seeing this from the point of view of the person who created it. They framed it, they saw it, they took the care, and that's to that point. That's when you have good photography. That's one of the things that you're most proud of. You're not
that's exactly
you're not proud of the sand dune. You're proud of the picture you took.
How
of that
you
sand
actually
dune.
composed that. Yes, and the decisions you made in that process.
That excitement you feel in your chest when you look at that image and you're like, even if it's just a selfie, you're like, that's a banger. That's that excitement is because that's what you captured, right?
Yeah. And even with all the technology. So again, I think this is important because you can still have very sophisticated technology in that process from capture to the final photograph. But if you are in control of that, that is an expression of what you're trying to show people.
That's what you heard. There's a classic image, Henri Cartier-Bresson with the sort of the decisive moment, right? This photograph, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. People can see it. You've probably seen it somewhere. It's an old photograph at essentially just when cameras were becoming portable enough to be sort of movable. It's this image of a construction worker leaping off of a ladder like a puddle, and it captures just before like a centimeter before his heel hits the water. So it evokes this incredible thing, right? And so we're able to capture that in our own lives in those ways of capturing those moments, capturing that look, that look of your cat or your child or whatever. But what's interesting now is as we move into these things is that insertion of these decisions, right? That are, and again, I want to be careful how I say this because I don't think it's necessarily bad.
Right.
The problem I have is the user, we're having less and less input or even choice.
Or even agency over what comes
that's
out.
right.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, and increasingly, so not only can these phones and things like, and do incredible things, even in the sort of, consumer to high-end professional camera systems, right? We've moved away from the digital SLRs and have moved aggressively into what's called like the mirrorless cameras, which have removed that old optical prism. You're not looking through the lens any longer. You're looking through an electronic viewfinder.
So now you've got the light coming in, it hits the sensor, and then the computer inside decides what you see as the photographer.
And this is an interesting conundrum for me, both philosophically, like metaphysics in that sense, where I'm like, what am I? Because what you're actually looking at, what your eye is perceiving, is a little tiny LCD digital screen that's buried in this little housing, and that, I mean, the benefit of it, right, is that it's showing you what the camera is going to expose.
Right, yes.
So if you've had this experience with a DSLR where you're like, it looks great, because it's going to look the same basically no matter what your settings are. Right. And then you take the picture and you look at it, you're like, what? That's lousy. Yep. What happened? The advantage of electronic viewfinders is that it can show you what the exposure is going to look like, because it's giving you a live read basically off of the sensor.
Right, yes.
But even in there is sort of the computer in the middle. That is the image that you see, of course, that's going to the electronic viewfinder either is or can be pre-manipulated by these sort of these. Right, there's I mean, if you look at any new flagship.
I should say, as you're saying this, I've got Sean in front of me cuddling his new camera with his electronic viewfinder, so you can feel the tension in this relationship. You love it, but you're not sure.
But I'm suspicious, right? It's cautious. It's a cautious love. But even for me, so I've been using mirrorless cameras professionally for a long time. In fact, one of the first flagships that I really enjoyed was the Olympus, the OM series, because they came out first retro styled. It very looked like an OM, an old OM 35 millimeter.
Series. For those old enough to remember these, a beautiful film camera.
Great cameras. So I've been using them for a long time, and even then had a lot of issues. I mean, the Sony line, they're a very popular mirrorless line that has come up too. In fact, a lot of the Sony sensors are in, I mean, that's what's in our iPhones, I believe, the Sony sensors. But, originally the electronic viewfinder had a lot of issues. It was slow. So you pull it up, you're like, oh, it's, for me, I do, most of my photography could be categorized as like travel, landscape, or street photography. And so things happen in front of you and you're like, I want to grab that. And you'd pull your camera up and it's like, black screen, turns on, focus it,
and then everything's
gone. The decisive moment has passed, right? Which would be maddening for me. But so even as like just personal kit, I was very hesitant to go to a camera with an electronic viewfinder. The mirrorless technology in terms of the sensor, I was fine with. It was the viewfinder.
Right, yes.
Because as someone who is accustomed to having this control, having this mastery of this exposure, is now when I look through this viewfinder, I do find myself questioning what, and I see little things. So I think I was explaining this, even through this camera, there'll be moments where I'm seeing what is supposed to be exposed. When I re-engage the autofocus, I would get a glimpse of something else.
Okay.
And that really gave some pause. And the funny thing is, as I was talking about this yesterday, I got an update from Nikon that there's a software patch that fixes a glitch.
So you were maybe sort of having a glimpse into reality, and now they patched that so you can no longer see it.
And so what it does, it raises this question. You're like, well, what? Wait a minute. I want to see the world as I see it, because that's what I'm trying to do, is capture the world as I see it. And that really casts some interesting doubt.
And that's such a lot of philosophical questions there about sort of the insertion of technology into that process. So interestingly, this is exactly why I have the camera that I've got, which is it's a Leica M series, but digital. So it actually goes back to those earliest sort of 1920s cameras. But the viewfinder is completely optical.
You still have an optical
which
viewfinder.
I love, but there are huge compromises with this. So whereas you can pick up your camera, point it at something and take a picture in a fraction of a second, my camera takes a lot longer, and I never get exactly what I see. So it's that compromise between sort of feeling connected with the subject, but not being able to take that fast photo, versus having the computer show you the scene, but you can be far more responsive.
That's true. And well, it's funny too. 'Cause I mean, every time you put a rangefinder out too, I'm almost like, well, you always have that challenge of like, because you can't look through the lens, right?
I know.
You never,
you're always slightly disconnected. Yes,
but you'll never be. It's hard to be pinpoint on what's actually the edge of the frame.
But also, I can see the whole frame. So it comes back to this decision-making process and framing. With a rangefinder like this, you can see everything, and then you can see the small bit of that frame that is going to be your photo.
Yeah,
so again, it's really interesting, these trade-offs. So the rangefinder that I use is definitely not superior. I make a lot of compromises with this, but it suits the way that I want to frame and take photos.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess it's the same when you're beginning to look at your electronic viewfinder. You've taken the compromise of the computer inserting itself in between, so you can take the sort of photos you want to.
Yeah, and that's a thing of trust too. Is building that up. Is do I see the output? Is that what I is?
Yes.
And you know, for people like myself and older who have bridged these different eras, it's maybe less concerning. My concern is moving forward.
Yes.
For students, for users, for people who are interested in this type of technology, who have never, and the same, again, this allegory for, you know, writing, for whatever, if they've never done this and they start with this computational insertion, are we robbing them of
I was going to use exactly the same words.
Yeah.
Yes, they may be able to produce pretty pictures, but can they produce photographs where they are in control of what they're generating?
Yeah. And I have, you know, this is the kind of stuff that I wake up literally in the middle, and I'm not joking. I woke up like at 2:00 this morning with this thought of like, this is what we talked about last week with sort of the dead internet of like, is this contributing? Are we just going to flood? I mean, you can say yes, because we can take pictures of everything. We do. So there's lots of photographs of just whatever, right?
So AI is seeing an AI generated world. We think that there are photos, but
a lot of food is really important to photograph. You know, thank you, early days of Twitter and Instagram and all that stuff.
When AI writes the history of humanity, food is going to be big.
And you know, that's not also untrue. We can't exist without it. So in some ways, that actually comes full circle.
Right.
But yeah, and so I do worry that it's like, are we headed towards a landscape of photography where it's all the same?
Yes. Yep.
It's all beautiful in air quotes because it's going to the middle.
Right.
And this is, again, this argument holds with ChatGPT writing, with anything.
Yes, yeah. It's regression to the mean.
It's regression to the mean, which takes away those examples. And in photography, one of the things you painstakingly learn all the rules of photography, so you know which ones to break artistically to get what you want.
Yes.
Right. And what I have seen so far, and my concern with this, again, that pushing to the middle, is that the computational stuff removes those. Those are wrong.
Right.
That one, the subject is blurry.
Yes.
I'm trying to display motion and evoke motion. So I want that subject to be blurry relative to the background or vice versa or whatever. And the camera's deciding, no, that we need to freeze that because I'm assuming you're trying to take sports photography or you're moving
because
child.
It's being told what the rules are, and it's a rules follower.
And it's following those weights that say more often, and they're not wrong, more often than not, a blurry component of an image is usually a mistake.
Right.
It's wrong. Unless it's intentional.
Yes.
And how on earth does this know yet? It doesn't. Maybe it could in the future with enough learning, so to speak. But it doesn't know.
Yep.
And so the concern I have is, even if things like, again, will that creep into what you see as someone? So you're holding up your smartphone, you see, the image of your camera. That can be completely manipulated in terms of what you see. So you're making these. So in some ways, the automation can sort of automate the artistic decisions for you and feed you something that you go, oh, that does look good.
Right.
But that wasn't maybe where you would have taken it.
Yes.
And so there's this like philosophical sadness of like what we might lose out on.
Right.
Are those serendipitous discoveries of, oh my, I had, have you ever, going back to film days, ever accidentally taken a double exposure?
Right.
So you've exposed the same film twice and you get this weird ghosty thing and you're like, what is this? This is beautiful.
Right. Yes. Yep.
Never would happen. Never would happen in a digital era.
Right. So then with this, how do you square the circle here? Because I can imagine there are a lot of people listening and thinking, you photography elites,
you geeks,
you think we should do this the hard way and learn the hard stuff. But I love just taking photos with my camera. With my phone.
Sure.
I can do things now that I could never do.
Yes.
So how do you sort of marry these together? The democratization of image taking, and I would even say photography, because I think people do think about sort of what they're trying to sort of capture, versus the skill of actually learning how to use these systems and express yourself through them.
Yeah. Well, the way I would put that out there is basically with a wish list that I think would be pretty easily achieved. And I will give some credit. So even like major platforms like, the iPhone, for example, we'll put that out there because that's in the US specifically one of the most, a popular smartphone with those capabilities and stuff, even though Pixel makes them, there's a lot of great other devices out there. One of the things that they do, again, because they understand that the normal user may not have any experience, that it is you pull it open and you see that there's one button to press and voila, you get your image. Now, they do have abilities where through menus, you can go in and you can start to turn on other features. You can start to activate these things. So I am of the mindset where I think it is a wonderful boon to be able to just take this some device and just grab the image that you want to get.
Right.
That is beautiful because otherwise you're talking about you're missing opportunities.
Right. Yes.
Now, the trick would be what I would like is a way of saying, whether it's a little button or something that I press that says, I know what I'm doing. Let me be the fool who
put it into expert mode.
Put it into expert mode or have degrees of that. And even there, if they wanted to, these camera systems are so impressive in terms of what they can do. You can have like literally photography school built right in. Right. What does this feature do? How do you use it?
Yes.
You get bombarded with what's new in iOS, this, whatever. And you're like, oh, really? I have to say, like, you could easily implement that kind of.
I really like that. And that just opens up everything.
Yeah.
Again, we're getting close to AI here, but when you have an AI that is your teacher and tutor and mentor on how to express yourself more effectively with the technology, if you could flip it into that expert mode.
And when I think about the actual technology, there'd be no difficulty. Because if you actually peel these things apart and look at, again, the most modern camera, like the iPhone 16 or whatever, it's got the Pro, you got 3 lenses, of which at times more than one lens is activated.
Right.
So you're capturing more than you don't even get to see what the actual sensor is seeing, right? Which is part of what we're talking about.
Yep.
What I would think would be incredible is to have a tiered system that you could activate with full auto. I don't care. I just want to pick up my camera and take a quick shot. I don't have time or interest. I just want it to work.
Yep.
All the way to like an advanced expert mode, which is let me fiddle with every feature. Let me change the ISO manually. Let me do the shutter speed. Let me do the aperture to what it's capable of.
Yep.
But then simultaneously, along with like this AI system that could coach you through, it can also take the computational photograph that it sees.
Okay, so you got the two.
So you've got two. So you can say, well, Andrew,
this is what you took. This is what you could have taken.
You said you knew what you were doing. Let's look at your overexposed photo compared to ours.
Right.
Because some of those images too, some of the latest ones, they're taking stacks of 15 or more images at once in a second.
Yeah.
Or a fraction of a second. And then compressing those, keeping the good bits, basically doing composites. And so I could see there'd be this tremendous value of just like, a modern camera right now, I shoot in RAW and JPEG.
Right.
If I get it right, bang on, I got something I could easily share or upload right to my phone and whatever. But I also keep the negative essentially.
Right. Yes.
And I know there are ways in some of the current phones where you can do some of these. You're starting to be able to capture more RAWs.
Shoot in RAW. Yes.
But what would be really impressive is having that AI-based tutor, especially now that, again, I'm just going to pick on Apple because I've got an iPhone sitting right there.
Yep.
Is, with like Apple Intelligence and things like that, like this would be an incredible value add of this thing if I'm interested. And you could extend it even to the video components, right? But giving me that control, but then also walking me through like, hey, you took this photo, this area was really underexposed. Was that intentional?
Right.
If not, here's how you would address it. Or flip on our feature X, Y, or Z to not have that happen to you.
Right.
We took a safety shot and a backup just in case.
Right.
Because you don't want to miss that. If it,
of course,
your kid walking across the stage at graduation and you're like, I've got this.
But that was always the worst thing.
Yeah.
The photographs that you miss.
Yeah.
And now we're in an era where you actually don't need to miss much at all.
Now, and it's, I mean, again, modern digital cameras too will have what's called like pre-shutter release. So even before you take the picture,
already taking the photo.
It starts taking photos.
Right.
Yeah. So, cause it's like, well, there's a chance that you might be slow on the trigger there. So we'll take, we'll take a stack of photos before and after you press the shutter.
So there is one thing I have to ask you here, which is an extension of this, and this may be something that we revisit in a later episode. So you've got all this stuff where the computer, the AI sort of is part of the process of taking that image. Yep. But now we have the capabilities where you can manipulate these images. So, so a couple of examples. Now on the iPhone, you take a picture of a group of people and you don't want somebody there. You can just sort of erase them. You can sort of circle them and say, get rid of this person, and they're gone. Or you can, on some phones, take a bunch of pictures of a group of people and it will composite them so everybody's smiling. So the photo you get is not a reflection of reality. It's a reflection of the reality you wanted.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued to know whether you see this as part of the artistic process or whether you see this as a step too far.
I would say, well, I'll give you the best answer. It depends.
Right.
So one, you could make the argument that any photograph is not a representation of reality.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and you can kind of draw a big split if you were to like, okay, there's two types of photographs. One are meant to just be documentation of a thing.
Yes.
Right. That is where you would find much more of like the journalistic side of things, where you're like, you might be able to adjust exposure a little bit so you can see, but you're not to what's called push pixels.
Yes.
You're not to change anything.
Yep.
You're trying to do the best you can. And again, that's where the beautiful like philosophical element rolls in here is a photograph. What is that? Right.
Yes.
But so on one side, there's that element, which I do think that would violate. Right.
Yes.
So if the point of what you're
is to document
as true as possible, knowing that you can already argue if the phone is making adjustments for you, it's already edited something. Right.
Yep.
But that's one. The intent is to capture just a record of something.
Yep.
The other side is like more, if you think of our more traditional like photograph, which even at its basic, even a portrait painting, right, is a negotiation between the artist and the subject. Of course,
yes.
Right. And you can think about this is kind of fun. If you think of, if you start thinking about this, when you have had your photo taken or you take someone's photo, what's one of the first things you do?
You want to have a look at it.
Yeah. Well, what do you tell somebody? You're like, smile.
Oh, right.
Right. Why are you telling them to smile? That just in that act. So we do this all the time. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, cheese. Right. Or smile, whatever. You take that photo. By asking them to smile, you have asked them to change who they are in that moment.
Interesting. I had never thought of that. Yeah. So already you're intervening with reality.
I think about all these, I think, you think about all these like school photos or something where you're like, doing the smile.
You've completely messed with my mind now. Because I was going to say, I really dislike this idea of wiping somebody out. But now that you've told me that everything is fake anyway.
Yeah. So when you tell someone to smile, right, or like look this way, or sit up straight, that's a negotiation. And you're in a sense, what you're doing is you're creating. Let's stick with like a portrait because that's simple. Yes. One subject, a background, or whatever. If I take a portrait of you and I say, smile or look this way or look like you're deep in thought. What we're doing is we're creating essentially a persona or a caricature of you that I'm photographing because I think this will be objective. I think it's objectively better than one where you're like, But so even in that act, you're manipulating something that's not real.
Right. Okay. Which is a really important baseline. But now what happens? Say I take a photo of you and I say, smile, Sean, you smile.
It's crooked, my eyes half closed.
Yeah. And then I look at this and think, no, I don't want that. I'm going to make you look really mean. No. So I digitally manipulate. In fact, I don't even digitally manipulate it. I ask AI to change your facial expressions. So that's no longer a negotiation between me and you. It's me deciding what you look like.
Yep. And that's I mean, we've done, and that's a conversation that we've had again forever. Once you've captured that image, whether it's film or digital, now it's into the artistic hands of the photographer. So whether you're in the darkroom compositing it with other images or changing it, or in Photoshop. I mean, we've had the ability
you
to
are making decisions as the creator.
You're making decisions.
Yes.
And so that's part of that negotiation, which is like, again, am I a model that you are paying or whatever for this kind of thing? But yeah, that goes into essentially, as long as you have the right to photograph that individual, that is as the taker, that's yours to do.
Yeah.
Now, it does raise that interesting question of like, well, I think this is an increasingly pertinent question is how much have you changed?
Yes.
Right. I think even Instagram, last I checked, when I upload something to them, they have did you use AI with this?
Right.
Right. Which is interesting because I know there was a story a while back where another podcaster had gotten like engaged or something and shared these photos. They used Photoshop to do very lightweight editing of, exposure, crop, whatever, but it was being flagged as AI generated. Right. And so the guy, he's like, no.
Right.
He's like, no.
Just edited.
He's like, no, I didn't fake getting engaged. I used Photoshop to edit my images and put them up.
Yep.
But there is this question, and this will increasingly be important, is like how much has been edited?
Yes.
Right. I think traditionally you kind of have a pass for these like, we took 5 group photos, half was smiling in one, half in the other. Yeah. Everyone's intent is to smile.
Right.
There's nothing improper of me making everyone smile.
Yeah. But it's when you say, Joe blogged in the background, I do not like him. I'm going to get rid of him in every single photo.
You're gone. You no longer have to tear the
right.
Those breakups. You don't have to like tear the person, like you're no longer my friend. You don't have to tear the photograph of, to remove them anymore.
Right. You just say, AI, get rid of this person.
Yep. You can just circle them with your finger and magic happens and they're gone.
But it does feel like this is a big social question.
Yeah.
What do we as society consider to be appropriate, and how will that change as the technology changes?
Absolutely. And again, this sort of like this allegory of all these other things. It's the same with writing, with creating generative AI images without even using cutting the camera out completely.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that's fascinating there, if you use a lot of these like image generators, is you can ask it to mimic even certain lenses out of cameras.
Right. Yes.
So, and I use Midjourney quite a bit. And from time to time, if I want something to look a certain way, I'll say, as if it was shot through a 50 millimeter 2.8 lens, and it will mimic that sort of aperture aesthetic that lens would create. So, I mean, it's fascinating to think about what will the tolerance be. And kind of coming back, I forget which episode we were talking about this. Maybe it was just the last one of like, will there be this resurgence of proof that this was human created?
Yes.
Right. Where like, because you think about it, if you're buying art or photographs from a gallery, right, as the purchaser, if you have 2 images side by side that are, let's say, of the Grand Canyon or something that is there somewhat semi-permanently that anyone can go photograph. Which one would have more value to you as someone to purchase the art? One that was created, like I'm purchasing Andrew's perspective and his composition and his work and his point of view. I'm capturing that. I'm purchasing that because it moves me, and I want that on my wall. Versus, I'll take that AI generated one and frame it and put it on the wall. That's going to be really interesting to see because
it is. And I would be fascinated to know what the responses are, because I want the response to be that people say it's the process behind the photograph that I value. It's its provenance and its history. But I suspect most people will say, I just want a nice picture.
Perhaps. I mean, we have that today anyway. You buy a poster of something, right?
Yes,
like you can go to IKEA and buy, I go to the funny thing is every time I'm in IKEA, they have this,
Forget the photography. Your walls are just plastered with IKEA.
Well, I don't know if they still sell it, but for years they sold this large canvas photograph print of a red bike on a black and white scene over Amsterdam.
Yes.
And first of all, I'm like, oh, that is so like that stylistic thing of that the one. I'm like, that is so 2007.
Right.
But still, I always have that question. I'm like, who buys those? Because like I put up like my own art, right? So that's the thing. But that raises a big question. And I think today, right, a lot of times you can sort of there's a tell a lot of times with these images, but how long before that's not there?
See, that's it. Yes.
But what I'm really curious about is as these technologies mature, how will people be encouraged to use them and find ways of creating their own expression?
See, that's it. So now you've got the human in the workflow. It's AI generated. In fact, that's what I do with my Substack. Every image that goes with a post, it's AI generated, but I curate that.
That's right.
There's a very specific sort of input from me in terms of determining what that looks like.
And I think there's a beautiful place to kind of end here too, as we kind of think about this for now, because again, we can come back. We will be coming back to it. But as you were mentioning before, with a traditional photograph, right, the actual tangible item you're seeing is the very tip of an iceberg,
right? And
the art of that is if we use the iceberg metaphor, it's all the stuff that's under the water that you didn't see.
Yep.
It's the thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. We use the common rule of thumb in photography. Day one is like the first 10,000 pictures you take are going to be terrible. That don't worry about it, because people get so disappointed. They're like, "Oh, I took 10 pictures and they're all bad." I'm like, "Right, now that's 10 out of you got 9,990 to go."
Yep.
But same with because we've had this conversation I think a little bit before. But same thing with AI generated art. If there's still an artist, it might be different.
Yes.
Right. You're not doing certain things, but you're still in control.
That's it.
And the art then becomes what you don't see.
Yes.
And that I think is really compelling.
Yep.
I just worry as the way things are today that it's hard to separate the signal from the noise in that spec because everything is just flooded with things.
Yep.
But yeah, I think as over time, things will sort of settle out where you'll have the sort of quick things that are generated with very little intent, just like you have photographs. Photographs with very little intent. Those usually aren't in museums. Those usually aren't in galleries. They're usually not even making your, the photo album that you print out or send to grandma or whatever. The images that have the intent do.
Yes.
They rise above over time.
Yep.
And I hope something like that will happen too, because it will be really sad if we end up, just broadly, if we end up in a place where you can't tell anymore what's machine generated versus having any sort of human agency.
Right. And it's going to be interesting to see sort of how that evolves. But I love this idea, just sort of paraphrasing you, that the art of the photograph is in everything that you don't see.
Yeah.
And I think that applies to where we're going with AI-generated images, as it does with the history of photography.
Absolutely. I think it does. And I think, I say we wrap this thing up here. Otherwise, we're going to launch into another 101 reasons why Sean loves photography.
Yes. But this has been great.
This has been fantastic. But it is interesting because, again, this is a technology that this has had a lot of computational input for a long time. And it's something I think whether people who are listening are engaging in AI platforms, you can play with your cameras. You can play with these things. And just as a call to action, I would encourage everyone to start taking more pictures.
Perfect.
Start taking more pictures and enjoy. And create those personas. Tell
Great
people
place
to smile.
to end. Yes.
Fantastic. Well, I'll put it again. I'll stuff as much as I can into the show notes.
Yep.
But Andrew, awesome. Let's go take some pictures.
That sounds great, Sean.
All right. Thanks for everyone for joining and for sticking with us this episode. And we'll see you on the next one.
See you next time.
Demodulating signal.
Moto Futura is a production of the Future of Being Human initiative at Arizona State University. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. To learn more about the Future of Being Human initiative and all of our other projects, please visit us on the web at futureofbeinghuman.asu.edu.
End transmission.